Do you think the number of complaints involving governing bodies has been static, or is it increasing at the moment?
There's no hard evidence one way or the other. I can only talk from personal experience. I've been involved at various points in my career in dealing with some very, very long-running and very complicated complaints. And I do understand from colleagues at the DFE a couple of years ago that they seem to be getting involved in a greater proportion of long-running complaints. So my gut feeling is that, yes, it probably is on the increase, but I don't think anybody has any hard statistics to prove it one way or the other.
We certainly live in a society which encourages complaints much more than we used to. So I guess that's going to make parents more likely to complain, whereas once they might have suffered in silence, which must be a good thing, really. I mean, you want people to come out with the problems, so that's not to say that there aren't vexatious complaints. But it's always struck me that they do provide maybe a challenge that governors don't really relish dealing with, because they're always difficult, aren't they? There are emotions involved, they normally run very high. And I mean, in my experience, where you've got to make a decision on a complaint, yes, there is a balance which pushes one way or the other, but they're very rarely clear-cut, 100% right, 100% wrong.
And I've certainly come across governors who've taken the view that, well, the last thing we need is a complaints policy, because that will simply encourage people to complain. And yes, it might, but actually, for everybody that complains, there might well be another 8 or 10 people who feel strongly about the subject but are not prepared to take that final step. So it's better to know that than not know it, it seems to me. And also, I think the standard DFE model complaints policy has stood the test of time. I think it's very good. And the whole emphasis in that is on getting an informal resolution, if you possibly can. And it has some very useful ideas in there to stop a complaint ever becoming a formal one that you then have to deal with through a panel and so on. But thinking back to the parents that you just mentioned, part of the problem is that the parents will ignore the procedure that's in place and just go straight to the head or straight to the chair of governors, and then it has to be batted right back down the line and you have to start almost all over again. But that's fair enough if you understand your procedure well and apply it fairly. There's no problem in doing that. It's just convincing the parent that they have to go back to square one and start again if they want their complaint dealt with fairly.
There are two other problems I've had with complaints. One is head teachers who, in fact, rather like to boot the thing up, the procedure, as quickly as possible, because it gets it off their desk and it sort of takes some of the personal heat off them, because they're not making the final decision. It's going to be the governors. And so many of instances where governors have had to resist heads doing that, and even then the head will still manage to fast track it maybe more than they should have done. And the other issue, which is maybe a bit more specific, and I don't know how widespread it is, but most complaints actually involve staff in schools. Nearly all complaints involve staff, what they've done, what they've not done, what they've said, what they've not said. And I've come across instances where that's been challenged by the unions because of this involving staff and they in some way are misperforming. Then that should be seen under capability rather than under complaints. And if you accept that argument, that actually takes out an awful lot of the complaints and the complaints procedure. And I've never anywhere seen any clear guidance on that.
No, I've had to do a bit of research on that myself, and it seems to me that the grievance procedure, which should be in place anyway, is very much for employees of the school, and almost anything relating to staff should, in most cases, go through the grievance procedure rather than through the complaint.
But grievance procedure is grievance for staff.
Yes.
I'm talking about parents complaining about something the staff, the staff has done or not done.
Yeah, indeed. which is trickier. And the other one I come across a lot is where a governor is complaining about the other governors and trying to use the complaints policy as a way of dealing with that. And it doesn't work because that's not what it's intended for. And I think actually one of the things that a governing body might consider doing is writing its own procedure for dealing with internal complaints. And you can still adhere to all the good principles behind the formal complaints procedure, but set up a fairly straightforward, simple process for dealing with any sort of internecine disputes between, I don't know, the chair and another governor.
Yes, I can see governing bodies would probably be a bit reluctant to do that as a matter of course, but maybe it should be done.
You don't know you need it until it happens. And then, if you haven't got one, it's too late to write it. Really.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And of course, these problems these issues can be very destructive.
Yeah, very much so, and drag on for a very long time.
Yeah.
Because there's no obvious way of resolving them. Yeah. But the other thing that I've found important in recent years is to have a vexatious complaints procedure. I mean, it can be part of the overall procedure. But what do you do when you've exhausted your procedure and the person just goes on complaining? And goes on, and goes on, and goes on. And they do. In my experience, governing bodies are far too tolerant. They bend over backwards, to be fair. And all that does, in some cases, is prolong the agony. Whereas if you've exhausted your procedure and you've reached a conclusion, whatever the conclusion is, that's it. You're not under any obligation to do anything else. And really from that point on, you have to say, sorry, we're not going to respond anymore.
I think that's why the DFE has so many complaints to deal with, because of course those people will take complaints on, and I've seen it happen myself where parents not got the judgment they wanted from the school or then from the governing body. They've gone on to the DFE, and in fact and
their MP.
And their MP.
Michael Gove.
Exactly, and you know they're going to get the same response, no. But people want to do that, and it is difficult to stop. I think the bigger problem is your vexatious complainer, in fact, lets that one rest, but then dreams up another one. You've got to deal with each one. So that's,
Indeed.
That's a good point. I also wonder what you felt about the issues, not quite complaints, but when you get into dealing with disputes with staff, or the schools in a dispute with staff, say over capability procedure or staff restructuring. And they then get into discussions with the trade union, whether it's right for governors to get involved, I mean, particularly, or perhaps more so with restructuring the capability, because it's a governor's decision ultimately to restructure the staff, and should governors then actually get into wrangles with trade unions?
It's difficult to see how they can avoid that. I mean, it is best avoided, undoubtedly, because it's a highly skilled governor that can actually manage a situation like that, because obviously the unions have paid officials who are trained in that field, whereas governors seldom have that specific expertise. But I would imagine this could be more of an issue in academies, with more and more academies coming on stream, and of course academies have the freedom to change terms and conditions. So the potential for it to arise, I think, is probably greater in an academy. But I would have thought that the crucial thing always is to get good HR and legal advice from whichever source you happen to be using. Otherwise, you're exposing yourself to some pretty tricky situations.
Well, even with that advice, they won't necessarily represent you, and if you do have a problem, you didn't ask us to meet and show governors, you're probably going to say yes. I mean, it's worth the conclusion I've come to. That is that probably you should say yes and meet them, and then refuse to get further involved because that's not really your job.
No.